I'm Renee Lark, 43 years old, and I started my Army career as a private, throwing up on the side of a training field, certain I was going to quit. 25 years later, I was selected to command the very battalion that nearly broke me. For all those years, I carried other people's water, gave away my own sleep, and once crossed open ground under fire to pull 2 soldiers to safety, because I believe the people below you are never beneath you. But the weekend before I took command, a drill sergeant in a campaign hat stood over a collapsing recruit, told me to get off his field, and decided I was nobody. Have you ever been dismissed as nothing by someone who only respects power? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You are not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for someone who couldn't stand up for themselves, hit that like button and subscribe. It was the summer I turned 18 in the year 2000, and the first thing the Low Country ever gave me was a heat I did not know a body could survive. I had grown up in a cold river town up north, where summer meant a few sticky weeks, and then mercy. Nobody warned me about a place where the air itself felt like a wet wool blanket pulled over the whole world, where the sun did not so much shine as lean down on you with both hands and wait to see if you would fold. I almost folded. I want to be honest about that because everything I am going to tell you only makes sense if you know I started at the bottom of the hill, looking up, not at the top looking down. I had enlisted because I had no money for college and a great deal of anger I could not name. And a recruiter in a strip mall had made the Army sound like a door instead of a wall. I arrived at that installation in the dark, on a bus full of other teenagers pretending they were not afraid. And by the 3rd day, I had decided I had made the worst mistake of my short life. I could not do the push-ups. I could not keep up on the runs. I threw up on the side of a training field in front of 40 other recruits, and I lay in my bunk that night doing the math on how to quit. What stopped me was a drill sergeant named Hollis Reyes. I have to tell you about him, because for the next 25 years, he was the standard I measured every leader against, including myself, and because the man I am eventually going to tell you about was his exact opposite in a way that I felt in my body before I understood it, in my head. Drill Sergeant Reyes was not gentle. I want to be clear about that too. He was the hardest man I had ever met. He ran us until the world went white at the edges. He corrected a sloppy salute like it was a personal insult to everyone who had ever worn the uniform. But there was a line in him that he never once crossed, and it took me weeks to see where it was. He would push you to the floor. He would not push you into the dirt and laugh. He would make you do the hard thing 100 times. He would never make you do a pointless thing just to watch you suffer. The day I threw up, I expected him to make an example of me. Instead, he crouched down next to me, out of earshot of the others, and he handed me his own canteen. He said, "Drink, all of it." I drank. Then he said something I have repeated to myself in deserts and in briefing rooms, and in the back of more than one transport plane. He said, "This field belongs to the soldiers. Never to you, never to me. You stand on it to serve them or you get off it. That's the whole job." Then he stood up, and his voice came back, and he told the formation that Private Lark was going to run the next mile with him personally, and that the rest of us could either keep up or explain to him why a girl from a river town had more fight in her than they did. We kept up. I kept up. I have been keeping up ever since. I did not quit. I graduated on that same parade field in the fall of 2000, and Reyes shook my hand at the end of it, like I was a person and not a project, and he said, "You'll do." From him, that was a parade. I want you to hold that scene because the whole story I'm telling you is really about a field, and about who a field belongs to, and about a man who forgot. I deployed to Iraq in 2004 as a sergeant, and I learned there that the lessons of that training field were not just speeches. They were survival. The squad leaders who treated their soldiers like equipment got those soldiers hurt. The ones who treated them like people they were responsible for got them home. I made it a religion. I carried other people's water, literally and otherwise. I gave away my sleep and my socks and once my own boots. I came home with a stripe and a habit of mind I never lost, which is that the people below you are not beneath you. They are the entire reason you are standing where you are standing. I could have stayed enlisted and been happy. But a captain I served under in Iraq, a woman who had clawed up the same kind of hill I had, sat me down one night under a sky full of stars, and told me the army needed officers who remembered what the bottom of the hill felt like. She said most of them forgot the second they pinned on their bars. She said, "Don't forget. Promise me you won't forget." I promised her. I have spent the rest of my career trying to keep a promise I made to a tired woman in a war zone. So I went to officer candidate school in 2006 at 24 years old, and I was commissioned a second lieutenant. My mother came. She did not entirely understand what I had become, but she understood it was hard and that her daughter had done it, and she held my new bars in her palm for a long time before she pinned them on crooked, and I left them crooked all day on purpose. I made first lieutenant. I made captain by 2010. In 2011, I deployed again to Afghanistan, and there was a long, bad day in a valley I'm not going to describe in detail, where a convoy I was responsible for took fire and 2 of my soldiers were down in the open. I went and got them. That is the short version, and it is the only version I tell, because the long version belongs to the men who were there and not to a story on the internet. They gave me the Bronze Star with the V device for valor. I keep it in the same drawer where I keep Reyes's lesson, which is to say I keep it close, and I do not take it out to show people. I made major. I made lieutenant colonel in 2021. And in the spring of 2025, after 25 years of carrying other people's water, I got the phone call that every officer who came up the way I did secretly dreams about and is secretly terrified of. I was selected to take command of a basic combat training battalion. Not just any battalion. The battalion at the installation, where I had once thrown up on the side of a field and almost gone home. I was going to stand on Reyes's field again, this time as the woman in charge of everyone who stood on it. I should have felt nothing but pride. Mostly I did, but somewhere underneath the pride was a small, cold worry, the kind you cannot quite put into words, that turns out to be your instincts trying to tell you something before you have the evidence to believe it. I had a habit by then that I had picked up from Reyes without ever discussing it with him. Before I took charge of anything, I went and looked at it when nobody knew I was coming, not to catch anyone, to see the truth. People show you who they are when they think no one important is watching, and a leader who only ever sees the polished version of her unit is a leader who is being lied to and paying for the privilege. So the weekend before my change of command, I did what I always did. I did not check into quarters. I did not call ahead. I put on a pair of jeans and a faded ball cap and an old pair of sunglasses, and I drove onto the post I was about to command, looking like exactly what that drill sergeant would later decide I was. A nobody, a lost civilian, a woman who did not belong on his field. I parked near the training areas in the late morning, when the heat was already building toward the kind of afternoon that had nearly broken me a quarter-century before, and I walked toward the sound of a formation, and I had no idea that I was about to watch a man do the one thing Hollis Reyes had spent a summer teaching me, a leader must never do. I was about to watch someone treat the field like it belonged to him. The training area sat just as I remembered it, a wide, flat stretch of sandy grass, hemmed in by pines, with the same bleachers, bleached gray by 25 summers of sun. A company of recruits was out in the open, and even from a distance, I could read the shape of the morning in their bodies. They were deep into it. Shoulders were starting to round. A few were swaying the particular way a person sways when the heat is winning and pride is the only thing left holding them upright. I knew that sway. I had done that sway. I drifted up to the edge of the area and stood in a slice of pine shade where I was not really in anyone's way. An ordinary woman in an ordinary cap, and I watched. For a few minutes, it was just hard training, and hard training is not cruelty, and I felt the thing in my chest start to settle. The drill sergeants were loud. Loud is fine. Loud is the job. I had been loud myself for years. Then I noticed one of them. He was a big man, built like a door, with the campaign hat pulled low and a voice that carried over all the others, and he had singled out one recruit, a kid. They are all kids at that age, but this one looked younger than most, narrow through the shoulders, maybe 19, with the kind of face that had not yet decided what it was going to look like as a man. The kid was at the back of the formation, and he was struggling, badly. His knees had that liquid quality. His head kept dropping, and the big drill sergeant was not correcting him. He was hunting him. I want to be precise about the difference, because it is the whole story. Correcting a struggling recruit looks like getting in close, getting loud, getting his attention, then watching him like a hawk for the line between effort and injury. Hunting a recruit looks like circling him, performing for the others, turning his weakness into entertainment. The big man was circling. He had his hands clasped behind his back, and he was leaning into the kid's face and saying things I could not hear yet. And the other recruits were not allowed to look, and a couple of the younger drill sergeants had gone very still in the way people go still when they know something is wrong and have decided it is safer not to know it. I moved closer. I told myself I was just getting a better look. The truth is that something old and hard was waking up in me, the part that had carried 2 soldiers across open ground, and it does not ask my permission when it stands up. That was when the kid went down. He did not stumble. He dropped all at once, the way a body drops when the system has simply run out of road. He folded onto the sandy grass and did not get up, and one arm was twisted under him, and I started walking before I had decided to. And the big drill sergeant did the thing I will never forget. He did not call for water. He did not call for the medic who was supposed to be standing right there at every event like this one. He stood over the boy, and he raised his voice so the whole formation could hear the lesson, and he said, "Get up. Nobody told you to take a break. You think the enemy's going to wait while you take a nap? Get up! You're embarrassing yourself. You're embarrassing your family. Get up!" And when the kid did not get up, because the kid could not get up, the man nudged him with his boot. Not a kick. Worse than a kick, in a way. A nudge, casual, the way you would nudge a bag that was in your path. I have seen a great many things in 25 years. That nudge is on the short list of things that genuinely frightened me because of what it told me about the man doing it. I crossed the last of the distance. I crouched down by the kid, ignoring the man entirely, and I put 2 fingers on the side of the boy's neck the way I had been taught a lifetime ago. His pulse was fast and thin, and his skin was hot and dry is the word that matters. Dry is the word that turns a bad afternoon into a funeral. And I said, low and even, to anyone who would listen, "He is a heat casualty. He needs ice and shade and a medic right now." And the big drill sergeant turned his attention to me for the first time and looked at my jeans and my cap and my sunglasses and decided he knew exactly what I was. He said, "Ma'am, I don't know who let you in here, but this is a closed training area. Get off my field." There it was. My field. I did not look up at him. I was looking at the boy. I said again, "He needs a medic and ice. Now." The man's voice dropped into something colder, the voice of someone who is used to being the largest force in any space he occupies. He said, "Lady, family day was last weekend. You're done. Get off my field before I have you escorted off. Civilians don't belong out here." I looked up at him then. I looked at the campaign hat that Hollis Reyes had worn, that I had worshipped at 18, sitting on the head of a man who had just nudged a dying boy with his boot. And I felt something in me go very quiet and very clear, the way the air goes before real weather. A younger drill sergeant had finally broken and was running for the medic and the ice. Good. The boy would be all right, or he would have a chance to be, which on that field that day was not the same thing, and which I had nearly had to provide myself. I had a choice in that second. I had it very clearly. I could have stood up to my full height and told that man exactly who I was. I could have watched his face fall. I had the rank and the right, and by then, the fury. Part of me wanted it the way you want a cold drink in the heat. But I heard Reyes. I heard him as clearly as if he were standing in the pines behind me, 25 years and a whole career away. "This field belongs to the soldiers, never to you. You stand on it to serve them or you get off it." The boy was being seen to. My standing there and pulling rank would turn the moment into a show about me on a field full of recruits who had just learned that their bodies could betray them and their leaders might not catch them. That was not what they needed. They did not need a stranger to win an argument. They needed the cruelty to stop and the help to come, and the help was coming. So I did the thing that I think was the hardest and the most important decision of that entire week, harder than anything I did with my rank afterward. I got off his field. I stood up. I did not say a word to him. I gave the boy one last look to be sure the medic had hands on him, and then I turned and I walked back toward the pines and the gravel lot, an ordinary woman in a ball cap who had been told she did not belong. And I let that man believe he had won. I got into my car. My hands were not quite steady. I sat there for a moment in the heat with the door open, and I listened to my own breathing, and I made myself slow down because the next thing I did could not be done in anger. Reyes had taught me that too. Anger is a fire. It is useful for exactly one thing, which is heat, and a leader who makes decisions while she is on fire burns the wrong people. When I was steady, I took out my phone. I did not call to complain that a man had been rude to me. I want you to understand that, because it matters more than anything else in this story. If he had only been rude to me, I would have laughed it off by dinner. I had been mistaken for a lost civilian more times than I could count. That was nothing. That was Tuesday. I made the call because of the boy, because of the nudge, because of the dry skin and the casual cruelty and the medic who had to be sent for instead of being right there. And because of the way 2 younger drill sergeants had gone still rather than step in, which told me this was not the first time and that the stillness had been trained into them. I called the post command sergeant major. Her name was Doreen Pike, and I had known her for 15 years, since we were both younger and hungrier, and she was the senior enlisted soldier on that entire installation and exactly the right person to call. She answered on the second ring, because that is who she is. I said, "Doreen, it's Renee Lark. I'm on the ground a little early. I just watched a heat casualty get mishandled on the training field, and I need 2 things from you before I take command on Monday." There was a short silence, the silence of a professional reorganizing her whole day. Then she said, "Go," I said. "First, I need eyes on that recruit at the hospital tonight, and I need to know he's all right. Second, I need the complaint history and the safety records for this battalion's cadre for the last 2 years, and I need it on my desk before I sign for the unit. All of it. The buried stuff, too." Another silence, shorter. Then Doreen said the thing that turned my cold worry into cold certainty. She said, "You saw Boone, didn't you?" Not a guess. A name? She already had a name. I said, "I didn't get his name. Big man. Senior drill sergeant." "Why do you say it like that?" And Command Sergeant Major Pike, who did not exaggerate and did not gossip and had 30 years of judgment behind every word she chose, said, "Because I've been trying to put a case together on Sergeant First Class Garrett Boone for 8 months, and every time I get close, it goes quiet. The complaints come in and then the soldiers stop talking. I think they're scared. I think the last command let it ride because he makes the unit's numbers look good and he's never put a foot wrong on paper." She paused. "You want the records, Renee? I will have those records waiting for you. I have been waiting 2 years for a battalion commander who would ask for them." I sat in my hot car with the phone against my ear, and I looked out at the pines, and I understood that the afternoon had not been an accident. I had not stumbled onto a bad day. I had stumbled onto a pattern that a lot of people already knew about, and nobody had been willing or able to stop. And on Monday morning, the man at the center of it was going to be standing in front of a desk, and behind that desk, where he expected to find an ally, or at worst a stranger, he was going to find me. I did not sleep much that weekend. I told myself it was the heat and the strange bed in the quarters I finally checked into Sunday night. But it was not the heat. It was the boy. His name, I learned from the records Doreen brought me, was Private Marcus Tate. He was 19 years old, from a small town not so different from mine, the first in his family to do this, exactly the way I had been, the first in mine. He was in the hospital with a core temperature that had spiked into the range where organs start to make decisions about whether they're going to keep working. The medics had gotten to him in time, barely. The word the doctor used in the report was barely, and I read that word 4 or 5 times in the lamplight of an unfamiliar room. He was going to live. He was going to recover. He might even, if he wanted it and his body cooperated, finish training. But the report made one thing brutally clear in the flat language of these things, which is that the delay between his collapse and the first cooling intervention had been longer than it should have been, and that the delay had nearly cost a 19-year-old his life on a Sunday morning in peacetime, 2 miles from a hospital, while a man in a campaign hat told him he was embarrassing his family. I read the rest of what Doreen brought me at the small desk in my quarters, with a cup of coffee going cold beside me and the window unit rattling. It was a thick stack, and it told a story that thick stacks usually try to hide. Garrett Boone was, on paper, an excellent drill sergeant. His company graduated soldiers. His physical fitness numbers were strong. He had been named drill sergeant of the cycle twice. If you read only the official record, you would want him training your sons and daughters. But Doreen had not brought me only the official record. She had brought me the other stack, the one made of things that never quite became official. Complaints that recruits had started and then withdrawn. A pattern of soldiers from his platoon ending up at sick call with injuries that did not quite match the explanations. 2 anonymous tips on the safety hotline, both about heat, both vague, both closed for lack of follow-up. A counseling statement a young drill sergeant had started to write about Boone and never submitted. And, the part that made me put down my coffee, a near identical heat incident 11 months earlier, a recruit who had gone down and been slow to get help, which had been written up as the recruit's own failure to hydrate and quietly closed. 11 months earlier. The same thing, and the system had looked at it and decided the problem was the boy who collapsed, not the man who led him. I sat with that for a long time. I want to tell you what I felt, because I think it is the honest center of this whole thing, and because I suspect some of you have felt it too. About your own workplaces and families and the small cruelties that everyone agrees to call something else. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel like a hero about to ride in. I felt sick, and I felt tired, and underneath both of those, I felt a slow, steady, load-bearing anger, the kind that does not flare and does not burn out, the kind you can build a decision on top of. Because here's the thing the records made plain. Boone had not gotten away with this alone. He had gotten away with it because a lot of decent people had made a lot of small, understandable, forgivable choices to look away. The young drill sergeant who did not submit the counseling statement, the medic who wrote, "failure to hydrate," the previous commander who liked the numbers and did not want the headache. None of them were monsters. Every one of them had a reason. And the sum of all those reasonable reasons was a 19-year-old in a hospital bed, with a temperature that had nearly killed him. I had spent my whole career promising a tired captain under a desert sky that I would not forget what the bottom of the hill felt like. This was the bottom of the hill. This was exactly the place she had been talking about. The place where it would be easy and warm and professional to be reasonable, and where being reasonable would mean letting it ride one more cycle. I called Doreen again on Sunday evening. I asked her one question. I asked, "If I open this up, formally, the day I take command, who gets hurt that doesn't deserve it?" It was the right question, and she knew it. She thought about it. She said, "The young cadre who froze are going to be scared they're in trouble. They're not the target, but they'll think they are. You'll have to reach them fast and tell them the truth, that you want what they saw, not their heads." She paused. "And it'll be ugly for the battalion for a while. Investigations always are. But Renee, the battalion is already hurt. It's just hurting quietly in a way that only shows up in hospital beds. Loud and honest beats quiet and bleeding. Loud and honest beats quiet and bleeding." I wrote that down. I have used it since. I thought about my mother that night for the first time in a while. She had pinned my lieutenant's bars on crooked in 2006, and I had left them crooked all day. And she had not understood the army and had loved me through it anyway. And she had been gone 4 years by then. I thought about what she would have made of the choice in front of me. She had cleaned other people's houses for 30 years, and she had a thing she used to say about it, that the people who treated her like furniture told her everything she needed to know about them and nothing she needed to know about herself. I had not understood that as a child. I understood it in the lamplight of that strange room. Garrett Boone had treated me like furniture on his field, and it had told me everything about him, and the only mistake I could still make was to let it tell me something about myself, to let the smallness of the insult shrink the size of my response. The response was not about the insult. I kept coming back to that, turning it over like a stone in my palm. The response was about a boy whose pulse I had felt under my own 2 fingers, fast and thin and wrong, on a field that a hard, kind man had once taught me belonged to soldiers like him. And if I made it about me, I would get it wrong. If I kept it about the boy, I could not get it wrong, no matter how it turned out. That was the whole navigation. That was the entire compass. I have given that compass to every young officer I have mentored since, because it is the only one I have ever found that does not lie. Make the decision about the person who cannot protect themselves, and the hard calls stop being hard to find. They are only ever hard to make. I went to bed that night with the decision already made, which meant I actually slept for the last few hours before dawn. I had been an officer long enough to know that once a hard decision is genuinely made, a strange calm arrives, the calm of a person who has stopped negotiating with herself. In the morning, I would put on my uniform for the first time on that post. I would stand on Reyes's field and take the Gordon and become responsible for every soul on it. And then I would walk into my new office, and I would send for Sergeant First Class Garrett Boone, and he would walk in expecting to meet a new boss he could read and manage the way he had read and managed every boss before me. He was going to meet the woman from the field instead. Change of command ceremonies are built out of ritual, and ritual exists to carry you when feeling would fail you. I was grateful for it that Monday morning. There is a script. You stand, you salute. The colors pass from one set of hands to another. The units guided, that little flag on a pole that holds the whole soul of an organization. And when it touches your hands, it stops being someone else's battalion and becomes yours. Yours to answer for. Yours to protect. The brigade commander, Colonel Ardrey, presided. He was a decent man, careful, a little tired, the kind of officer who had survived a long career by not making waves. And I had already decided he was not going to be my ally in what was coming. But he was not going to be my enemy either. He would do the right thing if I made the right thing, the easy thing, for him to sign. That is a real skill, by the way, and they do not teach it. I stood on that field in my service uniform with the silver oak leaves on my shoulders and the Bronze Star ribbon on my chest. And I looked out at the formation, and somewhere in the ranks of the cadre was a big man in a campaign hat who had told me 2 days earlier to get off his field. I did not look for him. I did not need to. I could feel the moment he recognized me. There is a particular stillness that comes off a person when the floor moves under them, and it reached me across 50 yards of parade ground like a change in the weather. He knew. Standing in that formation, watching a woman he had dismissed as a lost civilian take command of everything he was and everything he did, Garrett Boone knew. And he had to stand there at attention and hold his face still and let it happen. The exact thing he had made that boy do. And I will not pretend a small and human part of me did not register the symmetry of it. When the ceremony ended and the receiving line thinned, I told my new sergeant major, Doreen, who had engineered a transfer to my battalion the moment my selection came through, because that is the kind of soldier she is. I told her quietly. Send for Sergeant First Class Boone, my office. 30 minutes, have a witness present, and start a written record of the conversation. She nodded once. She did not smile. This was not a day for smiling. She said, Yes, ma'am, and then, lower, It's good to have you here, Colonel. The Colonel was a courtesy. Lieutenant colonels are addressed as Colonel, but the way she said it carried 2 years of waiting in it, and I heard that too. My office still smelled like the previous commander, like the particular staleness of a room where hard decisions had been avoided. I had not even hung anything yet. The only personal thing on the desk was the nameplate they had made for me, a simple block of wood and brass that said LTC-R Lark, and I set it square in the center of the desk on purpose, because I knew exactly who was about to read it. Boone came in and reported the way the regulation says to report, and his bearing was perfect, which told me he was good at the performance even now, even with the floor gone. He marched to the front of my desk and he stood at attention, and he fixed his eyes at a point on the wall above my head, and he announced himself, and then his eyes dropped, just for an instant, the way you cannot stop your eyes from dropping. To the nameplate. LTC-R Lark. The woman from the field. I let the silence sit. Silence is a tool, and most people are afraid of it, which is exactly why it works. I let him stand there long enough to read the nameplate twice and do the arithmetic and arrive, with no help from me, at the full understanding of where he was standing and who he was standing in front of. I watched the performance crack, not break, crack, a muscle in his jaw, a flush climbing up from the collar, the face of a man who has just understood that the largest force in the room is no longer him. Then I said, Sergeant Boone, I believe we met on Saturday. Although I don't think we were properly introduced. You told me to get off your field. To his credit, or maybe it was just reflex, he did not deny it. He said, Ma'am, I did not know who you were. And there it was, the whole sickness of it, in one sentence, offered up without his even understanding what he had confessed. I did not know who you were. As if the problem with how he had behaved was that he had aimed it at the wrong target. As if it would have been fine to nudge a dying boy with his boot and humiliate him in front of the formation, as long as the woman who objected turned out to be a real civilian and not a colonel. I said, That's the trouble, Sergeant. You're exactly right. You didn't know who I was. You thought I was a civilian, a nobody. Somebody with no rank and no power who you could order off a field and embarrass in front of soldiers, and there would be no cost to you at all. I let that sit for a second. I want you to understand that the only thing that changed between Saturday and today is that you found out I could hurt you. The behavior didn't change. The boy on the ground didn't change. The only variable that changed is fear. And a man who only behaves himself when he's afraid of the person watching is a man who should never have been given a campaign hat and 40 children to shape. He started to speak. I stopped him with one raised hand because this part was not a conversation. I said, "Private Tate is in the hospital. He nearly died on Sunday morning on my field while you told him he was embarrassing his family. That is not training. I know the difference. I came up through this exact battalion 25 years ago, and I had a drill sergeant who could break you down to the studs and never once make you feel like garbage doing it, because he understood that the field belongs to the soldiers and not to the man with the loudest voice on it. You forgot that, or you never knew it." I paused. "We're going to find out which, and we're going to do it the right way, on paper, with your rights protected, and a real investigation, because unlike the last 11 months, this is going to be done correctly. You'll have every protection the regulation gives you. What you will not have, ever again, is a platoon of recruits whose safety depends on your character." I told him he was suspended from all drill sergeant duties effective immediately, pending an investigation, and that his badge and his hat were coming off that day. I told him he would be reassigned to administrative duties where he could not be alone with a recruit. I told him none of it was punishment, because punishment comes after findings, and that this was simply what a responsible command does when a soldier nearly dies and questions exist. Every word of it was procedurally clean. I had been careful. I had been up half the night being careful. And I watched the man who had loomed over a boy on the ground stand very still and absorb the fact that the largest force in his life was now a woman he had told to get off his field, and that she was not going to raise her voice even once because she did not need to. The investigation was not a lightning bolt. I want to be honest about how these things actually go because the movies lie about it. There was no dramatic confession, no single document that ended everything in an afternoon. What there was, instead, was something slower and in its own way more powerful. There was permission. I had told Doreen the truth about the young cadre, and she had been right. The drill sergeants who had frozen on that field, who had gone still rather than step in, were terrified when the investigation opened. They thought they were the target. So in my first week, I did the most important thing I did in the whole affair, and it had nothing to do with Boone. I gathered the junior cadre, the corporals and the sergeants, and the young staff sergeants, and I told them the truth. I said, "I am not looking for people to blame for being afraid. I came up enlisted. I know exactly how much courage it takes for a buck sergeant to contradict a senior drill sergeant with a reputation in front of recruits when the whole chain above him has decided to look the other way. I am not angry that you froze. I am angry that you were put in a position where freezing was the safe choice. I want to change the position. To do that, I need to know what you saw. Not to hang you, to fix it. The soldier who tells me the truth is the soldier I'm going to trust with more, not less." And then I waited, and it was quiet. And I thought for one bad moment that the fear ran deeper than the trust. Then a young drill sergeant named Sergeant Avila, who could not have been more than 26, stood up. His hands were shaking. He said, "Ma'am, I started a counseling statement on Sergeant Boone 11 months ago, after the last one, the last kid who went down." He swallowed. "I never turned it in. I was scared. I've kept it in my locker this whole time. I can get it. I will remember that young man standing up in that room for the rest of my life. It is one thing for a colonel with a Bronze Star and 25 years to take a risk. The risk is real, but I had a parachute. It is another thing entirely for a 26-year-old to stand up in front of his peers and admit he had been afraid and had stayed silent, and to choose, finally, to stop. That is the harder courage. That is the courage the whole army actually runs on, and almost nobody makes a ceremony for it. After Avila, the dam broke, not into a flood of accusations, into a quiet, steady stream of truth. One by one, soldiers came forward on the record with specifics. The medic who had written "failure to hydrate" came to me himself, gray with shame, and told me he had felt pressured to close the earlier case and had regretted it every day since. 2 recruits from Boone's platoon, once they understood they would be protected, described a pattern of small cruelties that never quite rose to the level of a single reportable event, but that added up, over a cycle,
to systematic abuse dressed in the language of toughness. And the records did the rest. Once we knew where to look, the gaps told their own story. The investigating officer I requested was a major from outside the brigade. A careful, unexcitable woman named Raina Cole, who had a reputation for thoroughness and not a single relationship on the post that she would need to protect. I asked for an outsider on purpose. An investigation run by someone with friends in the unit is an investigation that flinches, and I did not want one finding that anyone could later wave away as a favor between colleagues. Major Cole did not flinch. She interviewed everyone. She read every line of the medical records. She built a timeline of that Sunday morning down to the minute, and the timeline was its own quiet indictment, because once you laid the events out in order, the gap between the moment Marcus Tate hit the ground and the moment the first bag of ice touched his skin was impossible to defend and impossible to misread. Numbers do not have a tone of voice, they cannot be charmed, and they cannot be intimidated. That gap sat in the report like a stone in a shoe. One recruit, a young woman from Boone's platoon named Private Okafor, gave an account that I have not been able to put down since. She described how the platoon had learned to read Boone's moods, how they had developed a private system of warnings, a particular way of standing, a particular silence, that meant he had chosen someone to hunt that day, and the rest of them should make themselves small. Children. He had trained a platoon of 19-year-olds to behave like prey animals reading a predator, and they had become so good at it, so well drilled in their own fear, that not one of them had felt able to call for help when Tate went down, because calling for help would have meant breaking the silence, and breaking the silence had always cost them. That testimony, more than any single document, told me what the real injury was. It was not only one boy's body, it was 40 young people who had been taught, in their first weeks of service to their country, that the people placed in charge of them could not be trusted to protect them. That is a wound that does not show up on an X-ray, and it is the one I worked hardest for the rest of that year to heal. Boone, through all of it, did exactly what I expected. He was not stupid. He spun. He gave a flawless account of himself in which he was a demanding but fair leader, being railroaded by a new commander with a grudge over a misunderstanding on a Saturday. He was good at it. If I had been a different kind of commander, a vain one, a defensive one, the grudge over a misunderstanding line might even have worked, because it would have made me doubt myself, made me wonder if I was just angry about being told to get off a field. But I had not made the call about the field. I had made the call about the boy. I had been careful, that first day in my hot car, to know the difference, and now that carefulness paid for itself. There was no grudge to find, because the grudge had never been the engine. The boy was the engine. Marcus Tate, 19 years old, barely in a hospital bed, was the engine, and you cannot spin a temperature reading. I watched it all from the necessary distance. That was its own discipline. Once the investigation was properly launched, the worst thing I could have done was hover over it, because then it would have become the colonel's vendetta instead of the institution doing its job. So I stepped back. I let the investigating officer work. I protected the witnesses. I made the right things easy to sign for Colonel Ardrey, who, to his credit, once the evidence was undeniable, signed them. And I went to see a boy in a hospital. I went to see Marcus Tate on a Tuesday evening, after the duty day, in civilian clothes again, jeans, and a different cap. Although this time I told the staff who I was at the desk. He was sitting up by then, weak and embarrassed, and certain that his very short Army career was over. Certain that he had failed. Certain that the collapse had been a personal weakness rather than a near murder by neglect. He did not recognize me. Why would he? The last time he had seen me, if he had seen me at all, I had been an out-of-focus figure in a ball cap somewhere at the edge of the worst few minutes of his life. I pulled a chair up to his bed, and I did not lead with my rank. I led with the truth. I said, "Private Tate, my name is Renee Lark. I'm your new battalion commander, and I need you to hear something from me, tonight, before anyone tells you a different version. What happened to you on that field was not your fault. You did not fail. You were failed. There is a difference, and I am the person whose job it is to make sure you know it." He looked at me like the words did not compute. He had been told his whole short Army life that his weakness was his shame, and here was a colonel telling him otherwise. I watched a little of the shame leak out of him, the way the heat leaks out of a body when you finally do the cooling right. I told him he could finish training if he wanted to, and his body allowed it in a later cycle,
with no mark against him. I told him there was no shame in his record, and there would be none. And I told him one more thing, the thing Reyes had told me on the side of a field a quarter-century before, because it was the only inheritance I had that was worth passing down. I said, "This field belongs to the soldiers, to you, not to the man who stood over you. Don't ever let anyone tell you that you don't belong on it. You earned your place on it the second you got on the bus. The rest is just work, and work I can teach you." He cried a little. I pretended not to notice, the way Reyes had pretended not to notice me, and I left him with a phone number and a promise. And I drove back to my quarters in the dark, and I sat in the car for a minute the way I had in the heat 2 weeks before, except this time my hands were steady. The investigation closed in the late summer. I will not pretend the end of it was dramatic, because it was not, and the lack of drama is the point. There was no shouting match, no public unmasking, no moment where Garrett Boone broke down and confessed. There was a thick, final report, written in the careful, flat language of these things, and the language did not need to shout because the facts did all the work that shouting usually pretends to do. The findings were comprehensive, a documented pattern of maltreatment of trainees, a safety culture in his platoon that had normalized denying water and rest as tools of dominance rather than training, the mishandling of 2 heat casualties 11 months apart, the second of which, Marcus Tate, had nearly been fatal, and woven through all of it, the quiet finding that the previous command climate had enabled it by prizing numbers over people, and by treating complaints as problems to be closed, rather than as warnings to be heeded. Boone's career ended, not in a blaze. In paperwork, which is how careers actually end, he was relieved of his drill sergeant status permanently, his badge gone for good. The findings triggered the administrative machinery that exists for exactly this, and that machinery, once it finally engaged, did not stop. He left the Army under conditions that followed him with a characterization of service that told the truth about what he had done. He did not go to prison. This was not that kind of case, and I had never pretended it was. But the man who had told me civilians did not belong on his field discovered that he, in the end, was the one who did not belong on it, and that the institution he had used as a shield was perfectly capable of turning into a door and showing him out. I want to be careful about how I describe what I felt when it was over, because I think the easy version is a lie. The easy version is that I felt vindicated. The honest version is that I mostly felt the way you feel after you set a broken bone. You know it was necessary. You know it will heal better now. And still, the breaking of it, even in service of the healing, is not a thing a decent person enjoys. I had ended a man's career. He had earned it. Both of those things are true, and they do not cancel out, and anyone who tells you the second one erases the first one is selling something. What I let myself feel good about was smaller and truer than vindication. It was the young cadre. Sergeant Avila, who had stood up shaking in that room, was a different soldier by the end of the summer. He stood straighter. He corrected recruits hard and never once made them feel like garbage, because he had watched what the other way produced, and he wanted no part of it. The medic who had written "Failure to Hydrate" became the most aggressive advocate for heat safety in the whole battalion, the way a person who has carried a guilt becomes fierce about the thing that caused it. We rebuilt the way the battalion handled heat from the ground up that summer, and I made it deliberately, visibly unglamorous. Because the lesson I wanted burned into every drill sergeant was that protecting a soldier is not soft, and it is not a favor. It is the job, the same as marksmanship and land navigation and everything else they took pride in. We put a medic with eyes on every event, not on call somewhere, but physically present and watching. We made water a command responsibility, tracked and enforced, and I told the cadre that a recruit who went down from heat was a leadership failure to be investigated, not a recruit failure to be mocked, and that I meant it, and that they would learn I meant it the first time it happened and was handled my way. We posted the wet bulb readings where every soldier could see them. None of it was clever. All of it was boring. Boring, repeated and enforced, and boring is what safety actually looks like when it is real, as opposed to the version that lives in a binder and gets pulled out for inspections. The cleverness, the heroics, the dramatic rescue, those are the things you reach for after the boring work has already failed. I wanted a battalion that would never have to reach for them. The unit started telling me the truth. All of it. The ugly parts, because they had learned in the hardest possible way that I would rather have an ugly truth than a pretty silence. Loud and honest beats, quiet and bleeding. The battalion was loud and honest now. It had been quiet and bleeding for 2 years. I would take the trade every single time. I stood at my office window one evening in the late summer and watched a company come off the training field at the end of a hard day. And I watched the drill sergeants walking among them, loud and demanding and entirely without cruelty. And I thought about how close the whole thing had come to simply continuing. One more cycle, one more closed complaint, one more boy written up for his own near death. If I had not had a habit picked up from a hard, kind man 25 years before of going to look at a thing when nobody knew I was coming, if I had checked into quarters that Saturday like a sensible person and shown up Monday to a polished briefing, I would have inherited the same bleeding battalion and never known the wound was there until it killed someone outright. That is the part that stays with me. Not the reveal, not the nameplate, or the look on his face. Although I would be lying if I said those moments held no satisfaction. What stays with me is how ordinary the machinery of looking away is, and how 100 small, reasonable silences can add up to a thing that nearly kills a child. And how the only thing that breaks the spell is one person deciding, in a hot car, with shaking hands, not to be reasonable about the wrong thing. Marcus Tate finished basic training the following spring. He came back in a later cycle, the way I told him he could, and his body cooperated, and he did the work, and he graduated on the same parade field where I had thrown up at 18, and where, a year earlier, he had nearly died. I went to the graduation. I did not have to. A battalion commander does not attend every graduation, there are too many, and my presence was not required. But I went to that one, and I stood off to the side in my uniform in the same slice of pine shade where I had stood in jeans a year before, and I watched a company of new soldiers march across the field with their families, screaming in the bleachers. I found Tate in the formation. He had filled out, the narrow shoulders had squared up. He had the look they get at the end, the look of a person who has discovered the floor of themselves and found it lower and harder than they feared. When the ceremony ended and the families flooded the field, I watched him find his mother, a small woman who had driven a long way, and I watched her put her hands on his face the way my own mother had once held my crooked bars, and I decided not to go over. He did not need a colonel that day. He needed to be a son who had done a hard thing in his mother's hands, on a field that belonged to him now. But as the crowd shifted, he caught sight of me across the grass. I saw the recognition arrive, slower than it had arrived for Boone. But it arrived. He knew me now. He had spent a year knowing exactly who the woman in the ball cap had turned out to be. And he did not wave, and he did not call out, because you do not do that to a colonel across a parade field. He simply came to attention, there in the middle of his own graduation, with his mother's hand still half on his shoulders, and he held a salute. I returned it. Across 50 yards of the field that had nearly taken his life and had, instead, finally been made to keep him safe, I returned a 19, now 20-year-old soldier's salute, and I held it a beat longer than the regulation requires, because some salutes are about more than courtesy. Then I dropped my hand, and I let him go back to his mother, and I turned and walked off the field, the same direction I had walked a year before, except this time nobody had told me to. I have thought a great deal about that Saturday, and about the choice I made to walk away from a man who had earned a confrontation, and to make a phone call instead. People who hear this story sometimes tell me they wish I had let him have it on the field. They wish I had drawn myself up and announced who I was, and watched him crumble in front of his recruits. I understand the wish. I had it myself, standing in the heat with my fury waking up. But I have come to believe that the walk to the car was the most important thing I did. Not because confrontation is wrong, sometimes it is exactly right, but because that field belonged to those recruits, and a leader who turns a soldier's worst moment into a stage for her own vindication has misunderstood the entire job in the same way Boone misunderstood it, just dressed up in nicer clothes. The recruits did not need to watch a stranger win. They needed the cruelty to stop and the help to come, and, in the longer run, they needed a system that would protect them, whether or not a colonel happened to be standing in the pines. The phone call built that. The confrontation would only have built a story about me,
The best revenge I have ever taken, and I have had a long career and more than one occasion to take it, was a quiet phone call made with steady hands in a hot car on behalf of a boy I had never met, by a woman a cruel man had decided was nobody. That is the whole secret, if there is one. The people who underestimate you are telling you something true. They are telling you that they only respect power and that they will behave well only when they are afraid. The trick is not to spend your life proving them wrong to their faces. The trick is to build a place, a unit, a family, a life, where the boy on the ground gets helped whether or not anyone important is watching. Where the field belongs to the soldiers, where no one ever has to be a colonel to be treated like a human being. I command that battalion still. The campaign hats out on that field today sit on better heads than the one I met my first Saturday. And every cycle, on the first hard day, when the heat starts to win and some kid begins to sway at the back of the formation, there are eyes on him, fast eyes that were trained in the worst possible way to never let it go too far again. That is what one phone call built. Not a downfall, a floor, a hard, safe floor, under everyone who stands on that field, so that the next 19-year-old who folds in the heat gets a canteen pressed into his hands and a voice in his ear telling him to drink all of it, and that he is going to be all right, and that he belongs. The way a hard, kind man once told me. If you've ever stood in a place you earned and watched someone decide you didn't belong there, I would love to hear how you handled it in the comments. Would you have walked to the car the way I did? Or would you have pulled rank right there on the field? And have you ever stayed silent when you saw something wrong and wished later you had spoken up the way Sergeant Avila finally did? I read every one of your stories. If this one meant something to you, hit subscribe and stay a while. Because the field belongs to the soldiers, and being underestimated is not the same as being small.